Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for March 2nd, 2023. We in the Schiller Institute have begun a major campaign to have all sanctions against Syria lifted. This comes in the wake of the earthquake, which has hit the country not nearly as hard as Turkey, but because of the sanctions, humanitarian relief has been severely curtailed and prevented by U.S. policy. On February 9th, after the quake, the U.S. issued a partial exemption on sanctions against Syria, supposedly for earthquake relief. But this is completely inadequate. In fact, companies are still unwilling to go into Syria for fear that they'll be hit with sanctions. The idea of being partially exempt is ambiguous. And then, meanwhile, there's no transactions allowed. There's no flow of banks, money from banks, no money for rebuilding infrastructure. So what it means is that the people who were suffering from years of civil war, which was largely the result of the U.S. regime change policy against Syria, and now with the sanctions on top had been suffering, and with U.S. occupation through defense of the Kurdish groups in whole sections of the area of Syria where there's oil and wheat production, the whole situation for Syria has deteriorated dramatically. And there's no money for rebuilding infrastructure, purchasing material, providing fuel for electricity and heating. Now, the Human Rights Commission responded to this partial lifting by the U.S. by saying it's, quote, grossly inadequate because it largely cuts off any financial aid. The UN has called for lifting all economic and financial restrictions. And this was backed up by the Middle Eastern Council of Churches, and the World Council of Churches called for lifting all sanctions to alleviate suffering. Now, in this context, the U.S. is continuing to insist that the sanctions are there to protect the people of Syria from Assad. These sanctions are a result of the failure of the U.S. desire going back to Obama for regime change in Syria. Regime change which was stopped by the courage of the Syrian people, the resoluteness of President Assad, and the help from Russia. What was the U.S. doing? Well, as General Michael Flynn reported, the U.S. was arming the Syrian rebels, namely al-Qaeda and ISIS, with arms flow from Benghazi in Libya through Turkey into Syria. You have the obscenity of The Intercept, supposedly a progressive online journal, defending sanctions, saying that it's Assad who's using the earthquake to renew the call to lift sanctions. This article quotes former State Department officials, a fellow at a Middle East think tank, who said that Assad is the problem. It's not sanctions that are hindering humanitarian aid, but that Assad is, quote, quite simply a thief, unquote. So the narrative is there to continue killing children in Syria. This is U.S. government policy. As the U.S. portrays itself as a leading supporter of humanitarianism and human rights around the world, it's killing people in Syria, not to mention Yemen, Afghanistan, and other countries. Now, one interesting point is Congressman Matt Gaetz from Florida has introduced a bill, House Con Res 20, which calls for the removal of U.S. troops from Syria. The U.S. troops are in the area where the oil and wheat are. It's an area where we're backing the Kurdish rebel forces. And he called it Obama's war, although, truth be told, Trump also said we should take the oil from there to pay for what the costs of U.S. deployment. But importantly, he's called for pulling all the troops out. This resolution has to come to vote within 2 weeks. So this is something people can do. Call your congressman and demand that they support the HCON Res 20, which is the resolution to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria. Now, just to look at the next war that the war hawks who control the U.S. government are planning, there are all kinds of escalations going on against China. But this is occurring as support for the Chinese peace plan is growing. Even Zelensky said he's open to talk to China about this, but he used his comments to put out the lie that the U.S. thinks the Chinese are about to provide weapons for Russia, and that this is something which he said must not happen. Well, the Chinese have said repeatedly they have no intention to do that. But this plays into then the whole anti-China story that's building up. Congress is moving toward sanctions against China on the expectation they have that China will invade Taiwan. Again, the only problem China has with Taiwan right now is that the U.S. is going to be sending arms there. The U.S. is pushing for independence. And by the U.S., I mean the war faction, the neocons, the global NATO crowd. Now, they're talking about removing China from the G20. Well, the G20 just rebuffed the U.S. in its call for the G20 to support sanctions against Russia. What gives the Congress the idea that they can tell the group of 20 nations, which include a number of nations from the global south, who they're allowed to associate with and have as members? The G8 did kick out Russia to become the G7. Are they trying to do the same thing with China in the G20? Now, the chip war, which is also going on, is part of the effort to attack China's technological advance while weaning U.S. companies off Chinese technology. The question is, will we be able to replace those capabilities, especially in the decrepit state of U.S. industry? Now, one other note from the Congress, we have U.S. Undersecretary of State of Defense, Colin Kahl, saying yesterday, telling the Congress there's, quote, no evidence of diversion of weapons by Ukraine, unquote. Well, he neglected to tell them that there's no agency that's monitoring the distribution of weapons. There's no inspector general. And the question of oversight is still a problem. With over $100 billion pledged, including a significant amount of arms deliveries, there are reports that arms that are supposed to go to Ukraine are ending up in the hands of rebels in Nigeria. So the idea that was proposed by Senator Rand Paul, that there be an inspector general, was rebuffed by the same Congress, which is escalating the flow of weapons into Ukraine and to wherever else they go after that. Now, finally, on the situation in Europe, the German Greens are going for a scorched earth policy, not just in Ukraine, where the foreign minister Baerbock says that the Germans will continue to back the Ukraine war for as long as it takes, in other words, till the last living Ukrainian. But they're also going scorched earth against German industry and the German people. There's a European Union plan for banning all internal combustion engines by 2035. Now, this is being challenged for a couple of reasons. One, it's impractical. Secondly, the replacement proposals don't add up. There's no plan to increase use of synthetic fuel. There's no plan to increase the capability of battery charging on highways or in cities. It's a typical example of green utopianism, which is largely designed to reduce the quality of life and to destroy the auto sector as a leading element of German industry. Now, the economic minister Habeck, who's as green, as crazy as Baerbock, said that he is going to escalate the plan for climate neutral house heating in Germany. Already on the books, by 2024, all new home construction must have heating systems that are renewable. Now, Habeck is trying to escalate this by saying that by 2026, all existing homes with gas and oil-powered heaters have to replace them. Now, the warning from the Housing Association or the Homeowners Association, is this could cost 150,000 euros per family to reconstruct this heating system and electrical systems in houses. This just confirms our warning that a climate-neutral Germany will be unlivable except for the most wealthy. Now, go to the description section of this update, and if you haven't seen it yet, click on the conference, the online conference we had on Syria. It will open your eyes to the absolute merciless approach toward human life by elements of the U.S. State Department, the intelligence community, and so on. It's the conference we had on lifting all sanctions on Syria. So tomorrow is Friday. I'll take your questions. Send them to me at harleysch@gmail.com.